I'd like to introduce you all now to Professor Cath Haslam. Cath is a Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Queensland and the Director of Signify, which aims to translate the research of the Social Identity Groups Network to practice. She's a clinical academic whose work focuses on the social and cognitive impacts of identity-changing life transitions and interventions to manage these. We thank Cath for joining us today to present social connection as a path to social cure, a social identity perspective.
And Raina and your Bolton Clarke team, thank you very much for organising today's event. This is something that is definitely a must, and I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody's presentations in this afternoon. So thank you very much for bringing us all together. And it's pretty clear that we're all here because we know just how vital social connection is in supporting the health and well-being of us all, including older people who are going to be our focus today. So in my contribution to setting the scene, I want to talk a little bit about the theory and the social science behind this relationship. And I'll be focusing in particular on explaining why it is that our connections to the social groups that we belong to, like our family and friendship groups, our work and professional groups, our community and interest groups, why these groups have such a profound effect on our health. Now, this explanation comes from the social identity approach to health that we've worked on over the last decade and a little bit longer. And in the time that I have, I want to introduce you to this approach and explain why it's important to the solutions that we develop to prevent and manage social disconnection. But before we start, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which the University of Queensland, whom I'm representing today, stands, and to pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. For me and my colleagues at UQ, this land has always been a space for teaching, learning and collaboration for many, many years before it was established as a university campus. And it's really important to us that this tradition continues today. So an important question that often comes up for people when they think about the link between social connection and health is what factors are important? What does the science say which factors we should be considering, and how do they compare? So among the top 10 factors important for our health and life expectancy are these. Things like having an appropriate, having flu vaccination, which we've learned has been really important of late. Not drinking excessively, physical activity, social integration, exercise, taking medications appropriately, social support, managing exposure to air pollution, managing diet and also smoking. So what does the science tell us about their relative importance? Findings from the least to the most important factors for longevity are what you're seeing now, with the social factors topping the list. Now, these data come from what I think is one of the most influential studies of loneliness in our time, a meta-analysis that drew together findings from over 140 studies involving over 300,000 people. And here in the figure, what you're seeing is the odds of survival of each of these factors that I just mentioned in the previous slide, with those shown in the bars showing in red, indicating those social factors which are most impactful. The only ones that come close relate to smoking, which you can actually see here in these two bars below. And social disconnection is a greater threat to life expectancy than is physical activity, which is about here, and also diet. Now what the authors actually concluded was that people with strong social relationships have a 50% greater likelihood of survival than those with weaker relationships. And these aren't small stakes. 50% greater likelihood of survival are better odds than what we see in other health conditions and health contexts. So studies such as these leave us in no doubt about the importance of social relationships for health and life expectancy. But it's also the case that our relationships are pretty diverse. We have social ties and connections with significant other individuals in our lives, a spouse, a best friend, a confidant. But as I alluded to earlier, we also have relationships with groups of other people in our lives that we belong to, family, community, interest groups, for example. So this raises an interesting question for us. Are some relationships particularly influential when it comes to protecting our health? Now, this is a question that we and other researchers have looked at over the years in various survey and population studies, and I just want to give you a little bit of a snapshot of two that have been conducted by our research team. This first study looked at the effects that changes in our social groups had on mortality in the first few years of retirement. And what the data showed, which is what I'm showing you here in this figure, was that people who lost groups had an increased risk of mortality. So if you just lose 2 groups in that 6-year period, well, for those people, there was a 12% increased risk of early death. But when that loss was reduced and actually turned into gain over that same period of time, then that mortality risk reduced. So what was concluded from this was that with every group that people lost in retirement, there was a 3% reduction in life expectancy and a 10% decline in well-being. Now, in this next study, we compared the effect that different types of social relationships had on keeping people mentally alert and mentally active for longer as they aged. And our focus here was on comparing the influence of the number and quality of group and individual ties that people had and the effect that this had on their brain health. Now, when we looked at the effect of these relationships over time, controlling for a range of factors known to influence cognition, it was people's group ties that actually did the heavy lifting. But the thing that surprised us, and I think was even more striking, was the fact that these groups were even more important with increasing age. And this is what you're seeing here in this figure. So at the bottom is chronological age, and on the vertical axis is people's cognitive performance equivalent in years for people with below average, average, and above average social group ties. So let's just take that top line here, the orange line. Somebody at the bottom end of the age spectrum with above average social group ties performed more like a 46-year-old. So in lay terms, this is suggesting that it's giving them a 4-year equivalent in cognitive health, a 4-year saving in cognitive health. But at the upper end of the age spectrum, if we look up here, what this line is telling us that somebody aged 80 with above average social group ties was performing more like a 70-year-old. So essentially giving them a 10-year saving of cognitive health. So the take-home message here, I think, is pretty simple. If you want to keep mentally alert and active for longer, then remember to invest in your group ties. So while all social relationships matter, these and other data tell us that our social group connections seem to have a particular influence on health. So what's the theory behind this? Why is it that groups have this power? Well, it starts from the general idea that humans are social animals who have lived and evolved to function in social groups, such as these, whether they be our family, our cultural, our professional, our interest groups, our arts-based groups. And these groups don't just exist out there in the cloud, independent of us. Rather, they're pretty central and integral to who we are, influencing how we feel, what we think, what we say and what we do in different situations. So a large part of who we are, a large part of our identity, actually comes from these groups that we belong to. So a way of thinking about the centrality of these groups is to think about the number of times we actually introduce ourselves to somebody new through the groups that we belong to, as us members of the Lee family, us Lions supporters in Queensland, us practitioners, Australians, and so on. These groups are what form our social self, what we refer to as our social identity. And it's because our social identity is so central to who we are that when the group ties that make up this social self break down, then so do we. And we see this reflected in our health. Now, social groups have this power because they've been shown in research to provide the basis for a range of psychological resources that we need to support our health. They've been shown to enhance our self-esteem and self-efficacy. They help us to feel more in control of our lives. They give us access to health-enhancing social support, increase our sense of resilience, our purpose and meaning in life. And these are the ingredients that contribute to strengthening our day-to-day functioning, our capability, our engagement in society, our autonomy. So if we're interested in helping people to develop these psychological resources that stem from identification with groups of others, then clearly building social identification, a sense of us, has to be part of our practice. So a way of illustrating this is that social identity provides a basis for connection and community, helping us to feel more supported, helping us to build our control, purpose and meaning in life, which contributes to our mental health and resilience, and that further develops and establishes our social identity as part of a virtuous circle of social identification. But as we know, we live in a world in which positive social identity is often under threat, particularly as a result of significant life transitions and significant events that we experience, such as these. So when our valued social identities are compromised, when our valued social groups are compromised, then this poses major risks for our health. So again, just to illustrate this, where we lack social identity, we experience a sense of disconnection and loneliness, alienation, frustration, and this contributes to exacerbating distress, dysfunction and vulnerability, which then further reduces and diminishes our social self. Now, we've tested this theorising and reasoning in a range of group intervention studies, and the primary intention of using these groups was pretty simple. What we wanted to do was to see whether these groups helped people build that virtuous circle of social identification with others, and through this actually enhance their health and well-being. Now, these interventions have been pretty diverse, and you can see illustrated here just a couple of examples of what these targeted. They've ranged from engaging people in reminiscence groups to facilitate collective recollection, therapy groups, water clubs to combat dehydration, sports clubs to manage mental health, and men's clubs to tackle social isolation in a minority group in residential care. Now, all of these diverse studies found evidence of improved health and well-being. So it wasn't just about the content of the interventions, as this differed markedly between these studies. Rather, the common ingredient here was the group, and where the group brought with it an increased sense of belonging, connectedness and identification with others. As members of reminiscence groups, design teams, water clubs and therapy groups, this is where we saw gains in health, in mental health, in cognitive health, in physical health and also in well-being. Now, the strongest evidence of the role that groups play comes from this meta-analysis that examined the effect that these group interventions with the capacity to build social identification had on the health of people taking part. So this included 27 studies, with the ones I've just illustrated among them. All were experimental studies run in applied settings that measured identification, health and well-being. And this figure here on the right shows the effect of all of these individual studies, and those showing the positive effect indicated here on the right-hand side of that red line. So the take-home point though from this is when you combined all of this data, the analysis revealed a significant effect of enhanced social identification in these studies, which when present was associated with improved health and well-being, with the size of the effect in the medium range. So as all this shows, groups can be very beneficial for health and well-being, but primarily when the groups matter to people, when they're ones that people identify with, and when they're ones that bring meaning and purpose to people's lives. Now, there are a number of things I think that these data and the theory and the science behind them tell us about what we should do to optimise our social group interventions. One key message that's come out from decades of our research is that not all groups have the power to influence health. Groups need to give people's lives meaning and value to bring about health gain. If they don't matter to you, they're not going to shift your thinking or the way that you feel or behave. And group identification is a key ingredient in this. It's a key ingredient in a group's success. You want people to feel a strong sense of connection with others in the group. This is what gives people a reason to keep coming, engaging in the group and supporting others, and accessing the psychological resources that I mentioned earlier. And in this, there are several questions that you want to ask yourself to ensure that group dynamics are not just left to chance. First, what's the basis of your group activity? What's the purpose it's serving for the people who are taking part? Is it one aimed at building physical resilience as part of an armchair exercise group? Or is it one that's trying to bond through shared interests in singing, film, art or a skill? You also want to ask yourself, what identity are you hoping that the group's members will take up? Identity is armchair exercises, film buffs, choir members. And how can you help people to build this identity when you have them on board in the group? There are some key ingredients around building shared identity. Things like helping people to prioritise and see the common interests that they share, the values that they share, but also working to help people feel a sense of belonging with the group, so they feel they have a sense of fit with others and the group is made up of people like them. So it's because the group ingredient is so critical that we don't want to actually leave this to chance. We want to optimise the experience of connection for people and ensure the activities are just right to support outcomes. And in this context, one final element that I think we need to recognise is that groups need to have a positive influence on people's lives if they're going to function as a resource to support health. Now, we all recognise that not all groups have a positive impact on our lives. Groups that promote conflict, groups that exploit, impose stress or humiliate, well, they're more likely to have harmful health effects. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't encourage group belonging, just that we need to help people identify those that are most likely to be helpful and curative. And for older adults in particular, there are two factors on this point that I'd like to stress. The first relates to age stereotypes. We've all seen these stereotypes about older people, of older people being perceived to be hard of hearing, having poor memory, being feeble. The danger lies in seeing oneself and identifying in this way, as it can come with some downsides. It not only affects the way older people are treated in society, but it also impacts on how they behave, with studies repeatedly showing temporary declines in performance when a person's age is salient. But remember too, that there are also positive stereotypes with ageing as well, of older people being older and wiser, more experienced. So the caveat here is to be careful about the identity promoted in the groups. And second, despite what we know about the power of positive group belonging, we also need to accept that not everybody wants to join a group, and we need to take this on board. A recent qualitative study identified 3 key concerns around 3 themes that people raised about joining groups. The first was a dread or fear of being in a group, which some find quite difficult to overcome. Some have experienced an accumulation of some negative group experiences, which can present some significant barriers, as reflected in this quote. And some also recall challenges of fitting in with others in groups, as expressed in this particular quote. So it's clear from this that we need to be careful in making assumptions about people's willingness and their openness to join groups. And we need to work to empower people to make the right connections when they're ready and in ways they feel comfortable doing so. Now, we've developed a program dealing just with this, Groups for Health, that specifically targets the building and maintenance of positive identification with social groups. Now, this isn't the focus of my talk today, but should there be time in discussions and in question times, I'm more than happy to come back to this. So let me conclude with just 3 points that stem from the social identity approach to health and that I think we can use in our practice. First and foremost, people's social group ties matter and they're central to good health, but particularly when they are ones that people identify with and are a positive source of influence. Knowing this, we need to increase opportunities for people to make these group-based connections in their local communities. And in this, we need to both ensure these activities exist and that people can access them and engage with them. And finally, if we're looking for a longer term solution, we also need to think about ways to empower and support people to find these connections in their community and harness their opportunities independently and in positive ways to make sure they meet needs and are used to best effect. So it just leaves it to me to thank some of my key collaborators in this work, to share with you this link if you want to know more about the work of our group and the applied programs that's informed, and also thank you to yourselves for your kind attention.